The sun was merciless that day, a spotlight the universe itself refused to dim. Ilara Wynn stood at the altar, her hands trembling inside delicate lace gloves. She'd always believed light revealed truth, until it exposed her ruin. Adrian's voice broke through the murmurs. "Before I say, I do, perhaps the guests should see what kind of woman I almost married." He turned toward the screen, where photos, fabricated venomous, flashed across it. Ilara in compromising poses that never existed. Gasps rippled through silk and perfume. Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. Her gaze found his, calm, almost pitying. Before she turned, unpinned her veil, and let it fall. The silence that followed her footsteps out of the hall was the sound of something larger than heartbreak. It was awakening. Outside, the wind lifted her hair like threads of gold. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, her old life shattered quietly, like glass submerged in water. The city moved on within hours. The story spread faster than wildfire, twisted through whispers and tabloids. Runaway bride, scandal queen. They named her before she could reclaim her own name. But Ilara didn't run. She disappeared with intention. By dusk, she had shed her gown and her surname. A taxi carried her out of the city and into rain. Her reflection in the window barely resembled the woman who had stood beneath chandeliers. In a roadside diner, she sat in silence, hair damp, hands still trembling. She traced a circle on the table with her fingertip, an orbit of thought, grief, and clarity merging into resolve. The waitress offered her coffee. She smiled faintly. It was the first real smile of her life, the kind that came after breaking completely. Adrian's world didn't collapse that night. Not yet. He laughed through the scandal, framing himself as the betrayed one. But in private, the cracks began. Contracts withdrew. Investors hesitated. Every mirror he passed seemed to warp, showing not triumph but fear. He told himself she'd come back, humiliated, begging for understanding. But Ilara had become a rumor, a ghost without a trace. In his penthouse, he poured whiskey over ice and watched rain blur the skyline. For the first time, he felt the silence she'd left behind, vast and accusing. He couldn't name it then, but something had shifted in the world's balance, and his reflection was no longer centered. Ilara found work under another name. In a coastal print shop where salt clung to everything, she mixed inks by hand and listened to the ocean breathing beyond the walls. Days turned into months, and silence became her teacher. She learned the texture of solitude, the rhythm of rebuilding. The owner, an old woman with kind eyes and arthritic hands, taught her that strength could be quiet, that new lives were printed one layer at a time. At night, Ilara wrote her thoughts in margins of discarded paper, fragments of dreams she would later turn into blueprints. She no longer mourned her past. She was repurposing it. The first design came to her by accident, a logo she sketched absent-mindedly on a receipt. The lines were bold yet fluid, like waves finding their path through stone. Maeve saw it, paused, and said quietly, "That's not just design, child. That's identity." It became the seed of something vast. Together they built a small brand, one defined not by opulence, but by authenticity. Ilara poured her pain into precision, her silence into creation. In the mirror one evening, she no longer saw the woman humiliated before hundreds. She saw a name that hadn't yet been spoken, the name the world would one day know as her empire. Years blurred into rhythm, dawn, ink, design, tide. Ilara became someone else. She called herself Lena Wynn, a quiet name for a quiet existence. The world no longer whispered her shame. It had forgotten her completely. But in that forgetting, she found freedom. She learned markets, branding, silence, and power. Not in the boardrooms of men, but in the steady pulse of her own making. Maeve watched her with quiet pride. "The day you forgive what broke you," she said, "you'll own everything it built." Elara smiled faintly. She didn't yet believe in forgiveness, but she believed in creation, and sometimes that's enough to start an empire. One evening, while researching market trends for a client, Elara stumbled upon a name she hadn't heard in years: Cross Industries. Adrian's empire, gleaming as ever, but faltering beneath the surface. Lawsuits, whispers, declining trust. Her pulse didn't quicken. There was no rage left, only recognition. A quiet hum in the bones. The world had looped back to her, uninvited. Maeve found her staring at the screen. "Old ghosts. Just unfinished business," Elara murmured. Then she closed the laptop, but the spark had already caught flame behind her eyes. The rebranding was subtle at first. A new name. A new front. She founded Vire Studio, an independent design consultancy specializing in corporate identity restoration. Under that banner, she rebuilt others while building herself. She studied the way power spoke, in fonts, in silence, in posture. She attended conferences, kept her head low, and let her work speak with devastating precision. Soon, companies whispered about her like a ghost story, a designer who could resurrect a brand's soul. No one knew her face. They called her the Veiled Architect. When her first international client reached out, she almost laughed. Cross Industries needed a rebrand. When she first saw Adrian again, it was through glass. The boardroom of Cross Industries was a cathedral of arrogance. Every surface gleamed, every word rehearsed. He entered with his usual command, flanked by lawyers and assistants. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? The girl in lace had been replaced by a woman of steel. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, smooth. "Good morning, Mr. Cross. I'm here to rebuild your name." He smiled with professional charm, unaware of the irony that his ruin had already begun, and that the architect of his resurrection was the ghost he'd humiliated. That night, Elara stood alone in her penthouse, her own this time, overlooking the same city that once witnessed her humiliation. But now, every light in those towers answered to her name. She touched the edge of her old wedding veil, preserved in a glass frame. The woman she'd been was gone. Yet she whispered to her reflection, "Thank you." Because it was the end of that girl that began this empire. And tomorrow, when Adrian shook her hand again, she would begin the slow, exquisite art of undoing him, not with hatred, but with elegance. Power, she learned, was not about shouting louder. It was about speaking last. Within 3 years, Vire Studio had become an empire of its own. International clients, whisper networks, silent partnerships. What had begun as anonymity became her fortress. Jonas watched her transformation in awe. The precision, the restraint. He'd once worked under Adrian. Now he worked beside a woman Adrian couldn't recognize. Fate was poetic that way. One night, as they stood overlooking a skyline of deals and secrets, Jonas said softly, "If you ever tell him who you are," Elara cut in, her voice gentle, "he'll know when it matters. Not before." Adrian began to notice her, not as a woman, but as a force. Every meeting left him unsettled. Her insight was unnervingly precise, her silences sharper than critique. She spoke of rebranding his empire with phrases that echoed his past words to her, the ones he'd once used to manipulate. Hearing them from her lips, redefined and powerful, made him falter. There were moments, brief, flickering, when her gaze lingered too long, when something familiar hovered just beyond recognition. But ghosts don't rush revelation. They wait. They haunt quietly. Late one evening, Jonas found her in the office, sketching in silence. "You don't sleep," he said softly. "I do," she replied without looking up. "Just not at night." He hesitated, then asked, "Is this still about him?" Elara paused, pencil midline. "It's about me," she said, And for the first time, it was true. The revenge had become something pure. The act of reclaiming space, of rewriting the narrative in which she'd once been erased. Jonas looked at her then, not as an ally, but as a man realizing he was watching history being rewritten by hand. The first domino fell quietly. A leaked memo, a miscalculated acquisition, a small scandal that snowballed overnight. Adrian's company, once untouchable, began to fracture. Elara watched from her penthouse, reports scrolling across transparent screens. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was inevitability. She hadn't pushed the pieces. She'd simply built the gravity that drew them down. Jonas entered with the evening paper. "He's panicking," he said. Ilara's eyes didn't move from the screen. "Good," she murmured. Let him feel the weight of silence. Weeks later, during a public press event, she unveiled the final design for Cross Industries' Rebirth. A phoenix of glass and steel. Its tagline read, "Renewed by truth." As cameras flashed, Adrian took the stage beside her. "We owe this vision to Ms. Wynne," he announced. The name slipped from his tongue before he realized what Hyde said. Wynne. The room stilled. Ilara turned, meeting his stunned eyes, a faint smile curving her lips. "Yes," she said softly into the microphone. "We do." And just like that, the ghost became flesh again. Adrian Cross woke to headlines that should have belonged to someone else. Cross Industries under investigation. Ethics breach alleged. The empire, head built on mirrors, was finally reflecting truth. He threw his phone across the room. Investors called. Lawyers called. No one had answers. In his silence, echoes of her voice filled the empty penthouse. Not in words, but in the spaces she'd once occupied. Meanwhile, Ilara stood at her own window across the city, watching the same skyline he did. One crown falling as another gleamed higher. Maeve had once told her, "You'll know you've won when you feel nothing." And tonight, Ilara felt exactly that. The investigation deepened. Board members turned. Friends avoided calls. For the first time in his life, Adrian realized silence was not absence. It was punishment. Vire Studios' involvement was questioned. Ilara's team handled every inquiry with poise, revealing only what needed to be seen. She'd woven truth like silk. Translucent but indestructible. Jonas approached her with a hesitant question. "How far will you go?" Ilara's answer was quiet, almost tender. "Far enough that he finally sees me, not as what he destroyed, but what he created." Adrian held a press conference to reclaim control. Cameras flashed like lightning. Microphones bloomed like flowers of accusation. He smiled too wide, spoke too fat. Midway through, a journalist asked the question no one expected. "Mr. Cross, is it true that your current lead consultant is the same woman you humiliated on your wedding day?" The silence that followed was thick as smoke. Adrian froze. The name Ilara Wynne already circling the world before he could deny it, and somewhere backstage, Ilara watched the broadcast in real time, her expression unreadable. Her reflection framed by the flicker of his undoing. He came to her that night. No press, no cameras, only rain. Adrian entered her penthouse without invitation, drenched, furious, trembling. "You planned this," he spat. Ilara didn't rise from her chair. "No," she said. "I built myself. You collapsed on your own." He paced like a trapped animal. "You ruined me." Her gaze lifted, calm and unwavering. "You did that the day you forgot I was human." For a long time, neither spoke. Only rain on glass, and the faint sound of a man realizing what regret feels like too late. After he left, she stood by the window long after the city lights dimmed. Maeve called, asking if it was over. Ilara's reply was quiet. Almost, because revenge wasn't about destruction anymore. It was about equilibrium. Restoring what had been stolen, reclaiming what had been silenced. She turned off her phone, walked to the framed veil on the wall and unlatched the glass. For the first time in 7 years, she touched the lace, not as a relic of shame, but as a fabric of survival. Outside, dawn began to rise, soft and unassuming, the color of forgiveness not yet spoken. By dawn, Cross Industries was in free fall. Stock frozen, accounts seized, investigations mounting. The empire Adrian had sculpted with arrogance now collapsed under the weight of its own shadows. He sat in his office as the sun rose behind the towers, the same golden light that had once framed his triumph. But sunlight has no loyalty. It exposes everything, even the dust beneath ambition. Somewhere across the city, Ilara sipped her coffee, watching the news without emotion. She'd learned to see endings not as vengeance, but as gravity fulfilling its purpose. When glass breaks, it never apologizes for shining first. 3 weeks later, she was invited to a shareholder hearing. Her name, Ilara Wynn, was now everywhere. Adrian attended too, thinner, subdued. Gone was the arrogance. In its place, something human, remorse maybe. When he saw her enter, he stood instinctively, as though greeting royalty. She took her seat beside him, calm and untouchable. The chairman asked, Wynn, are you aware that your restructuring model is the only thing keeping Cross Industries solvent? She nodded once. Then perhaps, she said, her voice like glass, clear, sharp, we should rename it something more honest. Weeks later, she visited the estate where it all began. The wedding venue had been abandoned, vines overtaking marble, chandeliers dulled by dust. She walked the aisle barefoot, like before, the ghost of her younger self flickering in memory beside her. The silence here was heavy, but no longer cruel. It was just silence, honest and complete. At the altar, she placed the folded veil on the cracked marble. You can rest now, she whispered. The echo was soft, as if the past exhaled relief. For the first time, she didn't feel like the woman who had been left, but the one who had walked away. Adrian found her there. His steps were hesitant this time, reverent even. I didn't come to beg, he said. I came to understand. She turned, meeting his gaze without hatred. You can't understand what you refuse to see. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. You deserved better. I became better, she replied simply. They stood in silence, two versions of history facing each other. The destroyer and the survivor, both exhausted by the roles they'd played. When he left, she didn't watch him go. Some ghosts deserved peace, too. That evening, Ilara returned to her office one last time. The skyline glowed beneath her feet, a city humming with her quiet legacy. Jonas entered with a folder. It's official, he said. Cross Industries is now part of Vire. Ilara smiled, faint and genuine. Then it's done? He hesitated. What will you do now? She looked out at the lights, voice low. Live without watching my reflection. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. The Empire didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. And sometimes that's all redemption ever asks for. It began with a letter. Handwritten, no return address. There are things I never said, it read. And things you never asked. If you'll listen, I'll tell them. Ilara found it waiting on her desk. The handwriting was unmistakable. The same loops that once signed her vows. Maeve advised against it, but Ilara didn't burn the letter. She placed it in her coat pocket and looked out the window. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, unaware that forgiveness was about to take form, not as mercy, but as release. He waited for her at the edge of the water. The same man, but smaller now, humbled by consequence. His estate had been sold, his name diminished, but in that stripped-down world, he'd found something resembling honesty. When Ilara arrived, he rose. No security, no pretense. Just two people who had once shared a promise. I wanted to say it before the world rewrote it, Adrian said quietly. I was cruel because I was afraid of being seen by someone who actually mattered. Ilara didn't answer. She simply looked at him, and for the first time in years, she saw not the man who'd broken her, but the man broken by himself. They sat beneath an old maple tree, the lake behind them still and gray. Adrian's voice trembled as he spoke. I thought power would protect me. That love made me weak. You proved me wrong. Ilara listened, not to forgive, but to witness. I ruined the best thing that ever stood in front of me, he whispered. You don't have to answer that. I just needed you to hear me without the noise. She took a slow breath. You're not the first man who mistook cruelty for strength, she said. But you may be the last one I ever let teach me anything. As they stood to leave, Adrian turned toward the lake. It's strange, he said. All this time I thought you disappeared, but I was the one who vanished. Ilara looked at the reflection of both of them in the water. His figure blurred, hers steady. You disappeared into noise, she said. You disappeared into silence. We just found different ways to survive. For a long time they stood in that mirrored stillness. Two faces, one clear, one wavering. Then Ilara turned, walking back toward the waiting car, her reflection fragmenting with every step. Some stories end with fire. The truest ones end with water. Back in her penthouse, Ilara hung a new frame on the wall, this one empty. The veil had been buried by the lake earlier that morning. Maeve asked, why not replace it? Because some things aren't meant to be displayed, Ilara said. They're meant to be lived through. She stood back, looking at the empty space. It wasn't absence, it was peace, the shape of everything she'd lost and found, held in quiet symmetry. Outside, the city shimmered, and her reflection no longer looked like a wound. It looked like freedom. Ilara rose before dawn. The city below still slept, unaware of the quiet revolutions that had shaped it. She no longer started her days with screens or silence, but with the scent of jasmine tea and the hum of possibility. The world was different now, though maybe it was she who had changed the way she saw it. In her journal, she wrote only one line. Healing is not the return of what was lost. It's the making of what should have been. And when sunlight spilled across the page, it looked almost like forgiveness. That evening, Virus celebrated its 5th anniversary. The event was lavish, but Ilara kept to the periphery, watching others laugh, network, toast. Jonas approached, holding 2 glasses of champagne. 5 years, he said. You built something untouchable. Ilara looked around at her team. Artists, designers, dreamers, people she'd lifted from silence into creation. Not untouchable, she said softly. Just unafraid. They clinked glasses, and for the first time the sound didn't echo of loss, it sang of living. A month later, a small envelope arrived. Unmarked. Simple. Inside, one line in Adrian's hand. Thank you for teaching me how to see. No signature, no address. Just words, heavy with understanding. She didn't reply. Some stories, she realized, weren't meant to continue. They were meant to conclude. That night, she stepped out onto her balcony, tore the letter gently into pieces, and released them into the wind. They fluttered upward, like tiny white birds, vanishing into the lights, the end of an era dissolving into air. Weeks later, she returned to the sea. The same coast where she'd once rebuilt herself now welcomed her like an old friend. Maeve was waiting on the dunes, a scarf fluttering in the wind. He never really left, she said. Ilara smiled. No, she whispered. I just learned to come back differently. They walked along the shoreline in silence, footprints dissolving in the tide. The sky blazed gold and rose above the water, and for a fleeting moment, Ilara felt infinite. Not because she conquered, but because she survived. Night falls slowly over the coast. Ilara stands alone at the water's edge, the tide brushing her ankles. She looks out into the horizon, not searching, not waiting, simply being. In her mind, she hears the echo of her own voice from years ago. Before hundreds, he broke me. And another voice, the one she carries now, answers, and I rebuilt myself before the world. The camera pulls back, her silhouette framed by an endless ocean, the last light glimmering against her. No veil, no vengeance. Only a woman who walked through fire and came out made of light.